Hello, everybody. My name is Jason Webb. I'm in faculty here at the University of Southern California in the Department of Comparative Literature, and it's my privilege also to serve as the Associate Director of the Shinzo Ito Center for Japanese Religions and Culture. And it's my great delight to be able to welcome everyone to today's event, both here in the room with us and also from around the world vis-a-vis the webinar system. I want to welcome our speaker, Professor Jess Abel from Penn State University, who will be speaking on the title of the talk is Practical Democracy, Cultivating a New Japan. Many of you may already know Professor Abel's very fine work. Her first book was entitled The International Minimum, and that focused on the development of trans-war Japanese internationalism. Her second and more recent work was entitled Dream Super Express, and that was a 1960s cultural history focusing on Shinkansen, on the Shinkansen. And she's here with us today to share with us some of her even more recent work. So just a brief remark about the format of the event. Once Professor Abel finishes her comments, we'll have time for Q&A. I'll moderate that session. Generally, what I'd like to do in the interest of fairness is to go back and forth between the live audience and the Zoom based audience. I will say to anyone who is accessing the event via Zoom, please submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, not the chat bar. And it will cue things accordingly so that I can see them clearly and prepare to present them to our speaker. So with all that said, why don't we give a warm Trojan welcome to Professor Jess Abel.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction and for inviting me here. And thanks to the Shinzo Ito Center for hosting and Shannon for all her excellent organization and helping out with all the details. Thank you. And especially to everybody for coming and sharing a little piece of your day to help me figure out this new stuff I've been working on. I know you didn't realize you're signing up to be enlisted to help me, but here we are. And so, yoroshiku onegaishimasu, please. This is a pretty new project that I'm working on and just kind of figuring out what to do with a bunch of materials that I've collected. So any help, suggestions, ideas, as well as questions that you have, I'm very eager to hear. My big question for what is I'm planning as a book project is how does a nation rebuild democracy or build democracy in the aftermath of fascism? As we know, a constitution and other structures and frameworks of government are the foundation, but not sufficient for an operating democracy because they only work if people understand them and accept them and abide by them. So you have to convince people of this. So in post-war Japanese historiography, there has been a lot of scholarly attention to both government level reforms in the first post-World War II decade, as well as to the contributions of civil society, intellectual debates about what democracy means, how to form it, cultural products that helped educate the general public, etc. But in researching Japanese national railways for that previous book, and I couldn't help advertising Dream Super Express here, in doing the research for that book, I came across another actor in post-war democratization, and that is large public or quasi-public institutions that were part of daily life all over Japan. And that includes Japanese national railways, which is the precursor to what you would use today if you went to Japan and rode on a train, JR. Back then it was JNR for the national. But also the national broadcaster, NHK, the police, the PTA, which was an American import and very much promoted by the occupation forces, but a movement that spread throughout Japan. All of these institutions took up this keyword of the day of democracy in order to explain to their employees, to volunteers, to new recruits, to the general public, how their institution would fit into this new Japan that everyone was talking about, and how the people who made up those institutions should behave in order to contribute to this new national goal of democratization. So why was this happening? Did everyone suddenly decide to love democracy in August 1945? Well, if you look at the explanations that these institutions were giving, what you'll see is that they were generally fairly self-serving. That is to say, they benefited those institutions themselves more than they really did that general goal of democratization. But given the broad reach of these institutions into society, I conjecture that their definitions of democracy could potentially be really influential. So I argue that these institutions of daily life formed a kind of intermediate level between the top-down government reforms and the kind of grassroots activism that helped to transform Japanese society and shape both the popular concepts and the practical democracy, the practices of democracy. So with these four cases, I hope to show the contours of the institutional promotion of democracy and its impact on society. Bringing concepts of total war and total empire into the post-war decade, I argue that we can find motors of what you might call total democratization in the institutions that shaped people's daily lives. And of course, just as there was dissent and there were conflicting goals within the context of both total war and total empire, total democratization certainly does not imply unanimous support or unity of purpose, but rather one tool of democratization in the immediate post-war period was the same kind of, or involved the same kind of mobilization as the war effort had. So how did these institutions try to shape democracy, and what did these various institutional style democracies look like? In order to answer that question, I'm just going to focus on one of those four institutions, Japanese National Railways. During the war, during World War II, JNR, I'll call it JNR, Japanese National Railways, took advantage of the circumstances of an ongoing war and the national goal of imperial expansion to promote improvements in the railway. So for instance, in 1939, they began work on a planned bullet train, the original bullet train between Tokyo and Shimonoseki. They worked on that for several years before the lack of resources forced them in 1943 to shut it down. But they got that project approved by saying, hey, this is going to be good for the war. This is going to help us with the empire, right? So they were really very effectively using those circumstances to promote their own interests. After surrender, that rhetoric soon changed from JNR is a motor for war and empire to JNR is the infrastructure for democracy. In the early years of the occupation, JNR continued to operate as it had been in the late years of the war as a government agency. In June 1949, at the order of the occupying forces, there was legislation implemented to reorganize JNR as a state-owned but independently run public corporation. In both configurations, both as a government agency and then as a independent public corporation, along with the rest of Japanese society, JNR faced the challenge of democratization within its own institution. At the same time, they also had to grapple with an increasingly active labor movement. So they kind of had pressures from a few directions. JNR's response to changes in labor laws and other government-imposed constraints, in addition to just in general the new zeitgeist of democratization and popular political activity, involved the education of its workforce in these new systems and attitudes and practices of democracy. And this is happening throughout Japanese society. So why focus on JNR? Well, two reasons. Model and influence, I summarized them there. So as for being a model, in the early case, JNR was an early case of reforms that were going to have to be made throughout Japanese society. So one former rail executive who had just been elected as a diet representative to the Japanese Diet, Saeki Muneyoshi, he suggested he wrote an introduction to a 1948 proposal for economic democratization that was being made in response to demands from the occupying forces. And in that introduction, he wrote that the democratization of public enterprises that form what he called the core of the nation, and he specified the railway and electric power. So that was what he kind of considered as the core of the Japanese economy. He said that democratization in those public enterprises could be the standard for reform of all public corporations. So here's this early example, we'll do it. And then once we've got democratization down in JNR, all the other corporations, public corporations in the country can kind of model themselves on that. So that's one reason. The other reason to talk about JNR in this context is because of its position in Japanese society at the time. It had such a position that it was sort of poised to have a really strong impact on public opinion. For one thing, it was Japan's largest business entity at the time. It was a major employer. They employed about 600,000 personnel in every part of the country, so both a lot, but also everywhere. And its functions were part of daily life for many Japanese people, right? Taking the train to work every day or wherever they needed to go. So there's a really broad and deep social presence. And so that put JNR in a position to facilitate the dissemination of the habits of democratic practices and the ideas of democracy. But then another question is, why was JNR talking about democracy, right? So that's a reason for us to look at it, but why were they doing it in the first place? This was kind of the question that started me on this whole project. As I was reading a bunch of materials, like training materials for JNR employees, and I kept seeing democracy. I was like, why is that part of learning how to work for the railway? Why are they even? So that was kind of my question. So why were they talking about it? And I basically have kind of three elements of an answer: the legal context, concern with public opinion, and a perceived need for a cultivated labor force. So the legal context, JNR leaders basically had no choice. In the context of the occupation, every public entity faced the challenge of recovering from wartime damage and at the same time adjusting to new post-war realities. The occupiers operated through the Japanese government, but their commands shaped the conditions of possibility for every kind of policy and operations of the railway. So, and the occupation's goal was democratization. So with the people in charge saying, what we have to do is democratize, that's kind of, they have to also pursue that goal. That pressure from the occupation included direct orders from MacArthur. It also included sponsorship and review of legislation that would be proposed in the Diet by relevant sections of the occupation bureaucracy. So occupation fingerprints are all over JNR policy. So to some extent, they're democratizing because they were legally required to do so. A second aspect was that there was a perception that democratization meant that public approval would become a major factor in transportation policy. And so there was an idea that JNR needed public understanding of their operations in order to gain public support for the kinds of improvements that they wanted to do. And so to that end, there was a wave of books and pamphlets that were created to inform the public about the need for rail improvement, right? People wrote things like, oh, well, if people really understand how the railway works, they're going to talk to their diet representatives, and the diet representatives are all going to vote to improve the railway. So it's kind of like a little bit of an idealistic understanding of how democracy works, but that's what they said. And so these books and pamphlets that were created to inform the public emphasize the dual role of JNR in both promoting the construction of this new Japan that was being built through rebuilding this important industrial infrastructure, right? So if we want to get the economy going, literally we need railroads, but also that JNR would be contributing to the formation of the cultural and democratic new Japan, right? So not just the economy, but the ideas. Just to give you an example, the participants in a September 1946 discussion sponsored by the Kokusai Kotsu Kenkyu publication, International Transportation Research. This discussion included various specialists from JNR as well as other railroads. And the moderator started the discussion with the prompt, how can we democratize in order to become a JNR that is beloved by the people? So if you democratize, people will love you. And because it's a democracy, people support you, and then you can get better. It's this kind of circular or spiraling building of democratization, needing the love of the people, which means in order to get the love of the people, you have to democratize. Third factor, educators who were involved in developing programs for the education of new and potential employees considered an understanding of Japanese society to be essential for being an effective railway employee. And so they included the general topic of social studies in all of their educational materials. Entrance exams for JNR run educational institutions, and therefore the sort of study guides for those entrance exams, and also the books that students used at these educational institutions, all included these social studies sections that themselves had lessons on democracy. And so this was something that students and new employees were being exposed to. The lessons about democracy and claims that railway employees were going to be the key to building democracy were all over these materials. I saw it again and again. And the frequency kind of creates this sense that maybe these materials were a significant source for railway personnel to learn about democracy, because they're not in school anymore, right? So they're not getting these lessons that students are getting. How, when you're out of school, do you learn an entirely new thing? This is one way that kind of that non-school education, that shakai kyoiku, was taking place. That if you wanted to go work for JNR, you had to take this exam, you had to study for it. And so there were also sort of correspondence courses for railwaymen. That was another way that people learn these things. So I think it was a significant way that railway personnel, and then potentially their families, their communities, right? They were not keeping this knowledge to themselves, but I imagine sharing it with people, that they could learn how to become a democratic citizen. If you look at the content of these materials, you can see that the educators of JNR, which included some sort of mid-level officials in JNR, but also rail experts outside the agency, that they had a strong interest in explaining democracy to the rail workforce because they saw benefits to the institution and its future in a democratic society that they would help create, right? If Japan has to be democratized, let's make sure it gets democratized in a way that is going to work for the railway. And so along with state actors and grassroots movements, these kind of neglected intermediate level agents, I would say, also participated in creating a lasting democratic system, and one that was shaped, therefore, partially according to their own interests. So what was JNR teaching its trainees when it taught them how to be democratic? Initially, training and educational materials that were produced right after defeat were very little changed. I mean, you can imagine if a book comes out in 1946, they just made some quick changes to the titles, a little find and replace, emperor is now the people, right? But other than those sort of cosmetic changes, they were not that much different from what had come before. And just one example, this JNR Youth Reader here, which was produced in July 1946 by the Ministry of Transportation. So July 1946, less than a year after surrender and 4 months before the promulgation of the new Constitution. This is really a transitional moment. So it's not that surprising that not much has changed from the wartime period. The preface to this book mentions this post-war crisis, right? So there's a recognition that we're in this moment of crisis, but the content is still really steeped in wartime rhetoric. There's a call for cooperation among all employees, and that really invokes the fighting spirit. And I have a quote up here with the sort of the relevant words that have my coloring there. In order to push forward in the transportation war, rather than each employee separately showing their strength, we need the organization for it. JNR has wonderful organization, and we are proud that our employees all fight bravely by fully obeying the commands of their superiors. It doesn't really sound very democratic to me. And it sounded a lot like what railway leaders were saying during the war. The use of war in particular as a metaphor for the work of the railway is definitely a clear remnant of the importance of rail, claims about the importance of rail to the war effort that were being made until less than a year before this. Rail had often been called a weapon of war, and workers had been implored to work hard with reminders that they did so for the emperor, right? It's worth working your hands to the bone because it's for the emperor. In this new context of defeat and rebuilding, this rhetoric became useful as a way to, or remained useful, I guess I would say, as a way to inculcate hierarchy and discipline and, of course, obedience, right? Obeying the commands of your superiors. Regarding the daily life of the railway worker, this JNR Youth Reader also encouraged them to be proud of their work, using that idea of working for the emperor still. They wrote, directly complying with the emperor's wishes, we are engaged with the emperor's railway, undertaking the glorious task of supporting the work of the emperor. With every small action that makes passengers or shippers grateful, we can bathe in the light of the emperor. So very similar to the wartime emperor worshipping kind of encouragement. References to war and the emperor were conspicuously absent from later materials and were conspicuously replaced by the words democracy and the people. This is partly due to American censorship. For example, a 1946 book on freight transportation has this deletion demanded in the censorship materials. You can see both the page that had been, I put it up here, so they had made this cross out and said delete, and you can also see the final copy that does not contain that phrase. But you can kind of get a sense of what the occupation censors were objecting to here. Freight transported by railroad is various, beginning with, and then delete the phrase war materials, of course, and other regular goods and extending to, right? So the idea of the initial sentence, the original sentence was, of course, war materials, right? Absolute priority. And then if we have some room, you know, some other stuff, things people need, right? And this new, the occupation is saying, no, just things people need, okay, is what we're sending. That kind of gets at an important change, but the rarity of deletions like this, I hardly ever in the materials I looked at saw things like this, which suggests that writers were changing their rhetoric in accordance with the times on their own. They knew what was going to be allowed. That rhetoric of war and sacrificing oneself for the emperor almost completely disappeared, but there were a couple of elements that were visible in this immediate post-surrender example that persisted very strongly. One is an emphasis on service, and the other is an emphasis on cooperative relations between labor and management. And I'll come back to those points in a bit. At any rate, the post-war JNR kind of embraced this really long-standing notion of service as a core of working life. And that combined with the anti-communism that already existed and was reinforced by the American occupation kind of shaped a lot of the democracy that they came to promote. So with the Constitution's transfer of sovereignty from the emperor to the people, the emperor's railway, of course, became the people's railway. The idea that the railway belonged to the people, though, meant different things depending on the individual's point of view or the institution's point of view. One important idea about what the people's railway meant was related to funding, right? That this was funded by public money, and therefore the people literally owned it, right? They bought it and owned it because they were paying for it. One government perspective we can see, and let me see, is that big enough? Yes, it is. Okay, I couldn't tell from my computer if you're going to be able to read that. This is from future Prime Minister Sato Eisaku. At the time when he wrote this in 1948, he was the Vice Minister of Transportation. Also at this time, JNR, remember, was still a government agency. He wrote that the recovery of in order to work for the recovery of JNR, we need the support of the public. And he used the idea of the people's ownership to kind of promote that public support. You know, it's your railroad, come on, you all have to support it. So he wrote a preface to a 2-volume collection of reference materials for the work and training of JNR employees. And in that, he wrote, JNR belongs to us, the people, right? So us, he's including himself in that Japanese people. In order to reconstruct our JNR, Wagakoku, that's right, it belongs to all of us, which has been destroyed, in order to raise JNR to its pre-war, no, more than that, to a strong form, we need the cooperation of the entire Japanese people. He then emphasizes his point, shifting the we a little bit. He says, we on the management side and the people must be of one mind. So kind of recognizing that we, the people, is maybe there's a couple of groups in there. One mind and one body, so that management and use correspond. We are not shirking our responsibility for operation, but if we Japanese people, primarily as users of JNR, cooperate unflaggingly with its management and improvement, I believe we can hope to show the very highest efficiency in the functions of JNR. How inspiring, right? Very highest efficiency. But this conception of the people differentiates to some extent between JNR management and this amorphous, the people, right? General public, but it omits the people who are going to be most directly involved in actually rebuilding JNR, and the people who significantly are the targets of the books for which he is writing a foreword here, and that is the laborers who are going to do the work of rebuilding. So labor, that's kind of a second perspective on who the people are. What did labor as a group think? In similar assertions from the political left, we can see that labor itself comes to be sort of the avatar for the people. And one example that I have here is from the Science and Technology section of the Japan Communist Party. They published a set of suggestions about the reconstruction of JNR. And they introduced a discussion of the JNR labor union with a critique of JNR as a whole. It's kind of roughly what one might expect from the Japan Communist Party. They said, that in spite of state ownership, and here's the quote that begins here, the desires and opinions of the common people who make up the body of the state are not at all reflected in the enterprise, which is controlled and operated only by the opinions of one section of the privileged classes and finance monopoly capital, as well as landlord power, plus emperor system-like despotic bureaucrats and militarists. And that statement is followed by a call to put operations in the hands of the people as part of the people's economy, with the JNR labor union at the center. I didn't include that part of the quote because it's kind of a long quote, but so they're talking about the people, but really JNR labor union is at the center there. As for the union itself, they also talked a little bit about what was called for in democracy, and it's a very similar notion that we can see in the context here is they're making a statement against the new personnel law, and I wanted to include the cover here because I just love that little funny exclamation mark. Kakutetsu! Can almost see the raised fits there. Anyway, where was I? They say JNR, wait, no. Here we go. They argued that because JNR belongs to the people, and here they did not say kokumin, but rather jinmin, so a little different from the government version, it's essential to rescue it from control by the government, which, and I quote, they said, aims to destroy and ruin it and sell it for the profit of a small number of monopoly capitalists, in the process of doing so, abusing legal constraints to fire laborers and ignoring the constitutional right to collective negotiation. And they used a broader definition of the people to call for public support, adding to this a plea to the entire Japanese people to cooperate in our struggle for the revival of JNR and the revival of Japan, right? So it's much bigger than just the railway. This is essential for the entire country. They argued that this was ultimately for democracy. They did not have nice things to say about the Yoshida Shigeru administration, saying it was trying to destroy JNR, which made it an obstacle to rebuilding defeated Japan and thus an enemy of Japan's democratization. So placing the democratic government as the enemy of democratization. And in contrast to that, the people are the ones who are really going to do that, do democratization. So they called for toppling of the Yoshida cabinet and election of a new diet that would, quote, create a plan for JNR's revival that takes in the views of labor, and concluded, let's build a democratic Japan, something we're all going to do together. Okay, but there's a third view of what the people means in the People's Railway, and this is connected to the idea of ownership shifting from the emperor to the people. At the same time, or because of that, there was a change in the stated purpose of the railway. JNR, as I said, had been envisioned for over a decade as a weapon of war. It's reimagined in the context of post-war reconstruction and democratization as a tool of public welfare. In a 1949 book about freight transportation via rail, there was a sort of a history of this previous wartime weaponization of the railway. But then the book explains with kind of a tone of relief, war finally ended and circumstances changed. So previous policies suddenly turned and transportation capacity was completely switched to public welfare. The previous military goods first transportation devoted only to war became public goods first transportation, prioritizing materials for construction, for reconstruction. So this notion of responsibility to the people and public welfare would come to be kind of the keynote of explanations for how to be a democratic railroader. So that brings us to kind of the last section, democratization from within. So how did JNR try to democratize through its own employees? So as I said, some important elements of democratization came from outside JNR through legal changes, especially in 1949, that 1949 reorganization of JNR into the public corporation, as well as new labor laws that were specifically related to those kinds of public corporations. Some writings on the railroad focused on these legal aspects and emphasized the importance of independence from government control and explained how to adjust to this new legal environment. But materials that were aimed at educating and training JNR personnel focused, as one might expect, on how the individual railroad employee could contribute to this national project through their work. So how can you, as a railway employee, help build democracy? And the idea that the railway was a key site for democratization is kind of permeates all of these educational materials. To give an example, there is a language reader just full of dialogues, sample dialogues that, I mean, we've all done these, right? For whatever language we're trying to learn. This one is English specifically for railway personnel. So kind of having situations that a train conductor might find himself in, and he has to talk to some, occupation official who's riding the train. I have to speak English. So all these kinds of funny dialogues. And there's one particular dialogue that was all about the importance of hard work and didn't say anything about democracy until the very end. And they're just talking about how hard work is really important. Then all of a sudden, let's leave no stone unturned to make a new democratic Japan. What? Oh, that's something that I always chat about on the train with my conductor. So this kind of insertion of the idea of, hey, let's build a new democratic Japan into a language learning dialogue kind of naturalizes the notion that JNR employees can contribute to the biggest challenge facing their nation, and that the way for them to do that is to devote themselves to their work. Right? If you want to be democratic, work harder. Besides hard work, told you we'd come back to this, there was a focus on service. Textbooks use the word setsugu, as well as the English transliteration sabisu, kind of interchangeably. So even in the same book, you'll see both of those words. But the notion of service, it had been a casualty of the wartime controlled economy and the devotion of rail to the war effort. So democratization was linked to a restoration of passenger-oriented service. This is kind of a way for the railway to democratize. We're not just for the emperor, we're not just for the military. We got to think about our passengers. There were informal efforts to restore the spirit of service immediately after defeat. In 1946, there was an organization formed by, well, maybe I should wait to give you the quote. An organization that was formed by two individuals, Sekiya Ryuichi, who had served during the war as the head of the Education Ministry section on non-school education, Shakai Kyoiku, and Miwa Shinkichi, who was then the director at the time that in 1946 was the director of a foundation called the Transportation Cooperation Association, Kotsu Kyoryoku Kai. And these two men were a little bit unhappy with the state of the transportation systems, which were in chaos. And they founded something that they called the Transportation Morality Society, the Kotsu Dotoku Kyokai. The aim of this society was to contribute to the improvement of transportation systems by elevating public behavior. I mean, it's the kind of thing that you still see on the trains today, like all those manner posters, right? Don't in New York too, right? Don't sit with your legs spread apart. Be nice to tourists. So this organization was formed in 1946. The following year, the organization published a reader for employees, specifically employees who interact with passengers, and addressing the issue of service. And there was a foreword by the Ministry of Transportation passenger section, right? Just that unit of the bureaucracy was the author. And this preface noted, or the foreword noted, that democratization required, along with material service, moral service is also necessary. In other words, the spirit of service held by those of us employees who deal with passengers must change to a democratic one. The thinking, attitude, and language of employees who come into direct contact with passengers has an immediate impact on JNR as a whole. So the spotlight on service turned into an encouragement of hard work on the railroad as a form of serving the people, and in that sense was a step toward democratizing the railroad as one pillar of a democratic society. So ideas like this were inculcated into the workforce through the JNR educational system, including entrance exams and study guides that were created to help those applicants succeed. And so I just wanted to talk about a few examples from the study guides to give you a real sense of what these students were learning. For example, a sample answer to a question about the importance of labor taught future employees who were trying to answer the question correctly along the lines of the model answer that they were given. So it taught future employees that democracy is not inconsistent with hard work, trying to counter a popular misunderstanding of democracy that sometimes leads people to think that hard work is stupid. But for all to be happy and society to develop normally, especially in resource-poor, defeated Japan, it is essential to work earnestly. The next sample essay, which is a response to a question on labor unions, praises the effectiveness of the unions and their connection to democracy in terms of the constitutional right to organize and engage in collective negotiation. It also notes the particular strength of the JNR union and its impact on the Japanese labor movement as the largest in the country. But it also suggests that laborers not push too hard. It says, the laborer's life is tough. A union must work to maintain a minimum level, but given society's economic circumstances, common sense tells us that we should not unreasonably strike. This is a difficult problem for unions, right? Oh, so this is a difficult problem. Well, excuse me, first time presenting. I mean, you can see like there's this tension, like, yeah, union's good, but let's not take it too far. So sort of trying to soften that a little bit. And then finally, there's a question that is directly about democratization. How has your workplace been democratized? So this is something that applicants might have to answer on the exam. And what are they told to say in this sample essay? Well, the sample response suggests that to some extent, they should say it's already democratized, right? The work of democratization is already complete because feudalistic or fascistic vestiges of the wartime railroad workplace have mostly disappeared, and instead, this part I'll quote, those above listen to those below. I think that is a benefit brought by democratization. So that's a sample essay. So that really kind of softens the sense of a need for workplace activism. And it also suggests that the growth of the labor union has brought a system of meetings and management conferences and other venues for the exchange of opinion between labor and management, to which the essay asserts division heads are responsive, right? So we have this democratic situation that's pretty much complete. So all the labor needs to do, the essay implies, is kind of go along with it, right? Just work within it. So to the extent that workers imbibed teachings like this, well, we can't know, right? But they did have to study it and learn it and respond apparently in this way on an exam to become railway workers. And so if they did believe it, they might be less likely to take action, such as striking. As the sample essay suggests, another theme of education about a democratic JNR was the promotion of cooperative labor management relations. And that was the second theme that I promised to get back to. So right here at the end, I'll just say that the concept of service and public welfare, putting passengers first, was used to teach workers that they should think about the good of the institution before the particular interests of labor. And some materials were more explicit than others in their warnings against dangerous ideas, which of course is a key secret word for signaling communist thought. This particular cartoon is not from a railway-specific publication. It's from a Ministry of Education textbook, Minshushugi from 1949, is democracy. So this is what students are learning, but you can see that the ideas are really meshing with what JNR is saying. So here we have democracy, who is making beautiful music through labor capital cooperation, versus, oh no, if you have the cello being played by the proletarian dictatorship, then all you have are the poor worker is just all by himself, and there's no cello without the capitalist. So the music is just not nearly as nice, right? So I'll just conclude here with the point that JNR taught a generation of laborers that the purpose of their work is democratization, and that the way to achieve that is hard work, a focus on service, and a spirit of cooperation with management. Can't measure the impact of those lessons in any particular way, but the lessons themselves and the people who wrote them are clearly responding to pressure from the labor movement by trying to undercut leftist claims about democracy through to the rank and file who are just entering the workforce. And I am going to stop there because I am now eager to hear your questions and ideas and criticisms. Yeah.
So, as I mentioned for the fantastic lecture that we just heard, in terms of the format of the Q&A, of course, we'd like to first ask for anything from the live audience, but those of you who are joining vis-a-vis the Zoom platform, if you could kindly submit your questions, not through the regular chat bar, but down in the bottom, you'll see a Q&A button. You can open that up and click in the window, and then it will come right over to me, and I'll put you in the queue. So, anyone?
I'm KJ. I study economics, and I also studied about the JNR around, especially around like 50s to 70s, Shinkansen project, because I'm focusing more on the large amount of debt that the Shinkansen brought to Japan. I think it was around about $500 billion at least. Like just for inflation, I think. And I was wondering, do you think that, and eventually that debt, of course, caused the JNR to end up being cut off from the government and go private. Do you think that the amount of debt that the JNR caused from the Shinkansen or project they're working on had an effect on like the function of government, and it's moving more towards like reluctance towards other public projects that's for expenditure?
Yeah. Oh, thanks. That's a really interesting question. That's something that I've been working on a little bit on the side recently. The bulk of those funds came from a World Bank loan. So I've just read through all of the World Bank files on this project. So this is just from the World Bank side, but some of the letters are from JNR, but mostly it's the World Bank perspective. And there was there was some anxiety about that debt and how anxiety on from both JNR and from the World Bank. The World Bank is like, are you going to be able to pay us back? And they kept saying, yeah, the Diet is going to vote to let us raise rates, we're sure. And then they did. So, okay, now we can. But there was this concern that they had to keep, because they were government controlled, they had to keep open these completely unprofitable lines, right? And they're like, this is bleeding us dry. Like, if we could just focus on profit like a company, we could easily make a profit. We would close all these lines that are just costing us money. And the bullet train actually was a big help in making JNR profitable because that made money, right? And so that kind of funded all of these other lines. And so there was this struggle with the government about what is our role, right? If you say we have to keep open these unprofitable lines, you have to give us more money, right? You have to pay, the government, the people have to pay for these because we're just losing money left and right. So there was kind of this, I don't even know if that answered your question.
No, I get it, yeah.
Okay.
There's 4 JRs now, isn't there?
Something like that. My research only goes to 1970 at the latest, so.
Yeah, I think it's JR West, which is one that's like really profitable.
Yeah,
The other ones where
West, Central, East.
Yeah, where they're like sort of operating like the lines which they wanted to close, probably. They don't make very much money.
It's, yeah.
I think they're interesting looking back. It's sort of what China's trying to do now with their global trade system, whereas Japan already went through with the amount of debt they've developed and how to deal with it. And now China they've expanded their system to it's going to far-flung cities where they don't really need such a fast and expensive service.
Yeah, yeah. Well, there was a similar process, yeah, as you said, with JNR and the World Bank. And they initially went to the World Bank and like, okay, now how about the Sanyo line? And the World Bank said, yeah, no, you don't have to do that. Like, go ahead, we're not going to pay for it, right? There was a sense that on the part of the World Bank, you've done the thing you really needed to do, right? For economic development, we helped you with that. We're not just a bank here, right? You don't need this for your development, so you find a way to pay for it. And they did.
It's very interesting.
Thank you.
Oh, and also there's an Abel behind you. But first off, yeah, thank you for the lecture. So yeah, I guess I have a couple questions. I think a couple times you used the phrase like democratization from within, and I mean, maybe you implied it throughout this lecture, but I'm curious how you personally evaluate that kind of idea, because I mean, considering if I guess we might have like moving definitions of democracy, but if we consider democracy as something that rises from the bottom up, it seems as if even if we see like the rhetoric of democratization happening within JNR as an institution, it still seems like that rhetoric is being handed down from the top down. And so my first curiosity is, yeah, how you evaluate some of those claims and how you might kind of develop those, develop that kind of conversation with the text and with yourself, as this project moves forward. So that's my first question. The second is in consideration of like what I guess historians call the reverse course, roughly 1949, possibly a little earlier, in light of the ROC falling out to Taiwan and the crossing of the 38th parallel and all of these movements. Was at any point like the JNR as like public institution or quasi-public institution, did it ever get heat from SCAP as like excess state intervention? Was that ever a concern? And did that ever kind of like threaten the management of the institution itself? That's kind of.
I'm sorry, wait, pressure from SCAP about what?
Mainly because if I'm not mistaken, actually, Professor Chiaba, if anything I say is like, but if I'm not mistaken, as I guess communism became this concern, one of the concerns that first the U.S. government raised was that excess U.S. state intervention, whether it be dismantling the Zaibatsu or other interventions by SCAP would appear to be acts of excessive state intervention on SCAP's part. Now, if okay, maybe this isn't really going to connect, but if Japan is creating these public institutions to control transportation rather than like leaving that to private enterprises, would that have been seen as like too much state capital? Does that make sense?
I see what
I
you're
mean,
saying. I see what you're
I think
saying.
Japanese post-war economic recovery was very much, I think, you know, it's like state development is very much in that conversation, if not like the leading narrative. But I was wondering how the interplay between like, particularly because you mentioned like are, you know, just sources from like associated with the Japanese Communist Party. Yeah, just how the Cold War might have like inflicted a dent or like some sort of like inflection point in this whole like situation. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, thank you. With regard to your first question, the rhetoric being handed down, absolutely. I think it was also bubbling up. The rhetoric was everywhere, right? There were plenty of grassroots organizations all over civil society, people going, okay, we're going to be democratic now. How do we do it, right? And so I think there are certainly within JNR, if you read the things coming from the labor union, that's to some extent top down, top of the labor union organization down. And so that's one sort of top down, but also, you know, the regular workers being unhappy and some of them kind of gravitating toward these ideas and some of them listening to their managers. So I think the rhetoric is in the water. And whether sometimes it comes from the top, as in the case of the SCAP deletion, sometimes. So I'm playing with this phrase mid-level, and I'm not sure exactly what it means yet. But because there are some government representatives that are a part of my group of people, you know, the Vice Minister of Transportation at some point, you can't call him mid-level exactly, right? He's upper level. But then on the other hand, there's, you know, the science and technology sector of the such and such department of JNR, right? These kind of mid-level bureaucrats who are they're specialists, they're doing their thing, they're writing a book about electrification of the railway. And in that book about electrification of the railway, they're like, okay, and you want to do this in a democratic way, right? You know, so that's what I'm talking about mid-level. It's not someone who's making the rules. Sometimes they're part of JNR, sometimes they're not. It's just some engineer who's writing a book for railway engineers. And he's got a bit on democratization in there. So it's kind of not clear if it's top down, middle, around, bottom up. It's sort of all over the place. And the question about the reverse course, I mean, it's hard to say what's the reverse course because there's also at the same time, there's that shift from being a government agency to the public corporation. So there's a lot of change going on. Certainly the change from government agency to public corporation was SCAP inspired, right? So that if you're saying what effect did SCAP pressure have? That's a big one. They said, okay, you can't do it this way anymore. There is some SCAP intervention on things like, how is the board of JNR made up, right? And how do you get it to be made up of people who are not the old people who used to do it, but a new group of more democratic minded people, right? So absolutely the occupation is putting its hands in. But the reason I want to talk about the mid-level is sort of what do they do with that? I hope that answers your question.
No, definitely. I'll be processing them. I'll hand it off to.
Okay.
So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for your insightful presentation. My question is kind of similar to Ike's first question, I guess. So the word democracy in Minshu is not technically like a new word to the post-war period. So I'm wondering, so it's one of those like, you know, Wasei Kangol Japanese-made Chinese characters that was used to originally translate concepts that came from the West. So I'm wondering, how would you kind of describe and evaluate the difference between post-war period suddenly treated this word as like new word and also how it was interpreted in the, I guess, the pre-war, mid-war period?
I don't think they did see it as a new word. It was a new Japan.
Okay.
And what is the new Japan? The new Japan is democratic, right? And, you know, so it sometimes there's the word democracy, but more often it's Minshu, Minshuka, Minshu Shugi. Yeah, occasionally there were references to the Taisho period and kind of coming back to democracy, but more often, okay, fascism over, war over, empire over, we're gonna have a new thing. This new thing for us is democracy. A lot of times they said we have to look at American railroads because they make better trains. They did at the time. Sorry, I spent a lot of years living in New Jersey.
Well, railway.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. They made better trains, so we got to learn from their train technology, but also we can learn from their democracy and how the train system works in a democracy, right? So there was a clear sense that this is not a new thing. This is a thing that exists elsewhere. We too should do that. And so it's new for Japan. This will be the new Japan.
And thank you, Professor. I missed the first part of your
It's okay.
presentation, so I wonder if you have already mentioned that. But I was thinking whether like the democratization in Japan, in also Japan, in JNR, affect its own like service quality. Because I read a book about like a steel factory in Manchuria, and it was a similar process taking place, democratization of a state-owned enterprise, and greatly affect the production, the quality of its production, because there were like conflicts between technicians and regular workers. Also because like democratization, the bureaucrats, they didn't want to kind of like how should I put this? Like they wanted to celebrate this democratization, so they passed all those proposals from the board, and some of them didn't work very well. So I wonder if the same thing happened.
Oh, so the impact of democratization on quality was to lower it in that example.
Yeah.
Oh, I think the opposite, at least to judge from these materials. So I haven't been able to read anything that was, you know, a report by passengers. Oh, JNR is so great now. I haven't found anything like that. So all I have is sort of statistics about ridership and kilometers of rail. And in that sense, it is improving. But the fact is that it was so wrecked during the war that, yeah, of course it's improving. There was nowhere else to go. But that focus on service is one that I think made a difference to the way people experience the railway, because it was this more passenger-oriented approach, which meant that, they weren't just really trying to focus on freight, and especially military freight and moving military personnel on the very limited amount of, but by the end of the war, the rolling stock was vastly diminished because of damage. The rails were not in great shape, so trains couldn't move as quickly, and there was just no time for maintenance. There was such over demand on the railway that they were constantly running trains, and so there was no maintenance and things were falling apart. And so there were fewer and fewer trains that went slower, and they were just jam-packed and oftentimes being used for military purposes. So during the war, yeah. So after, yeah, it's rough because the same situation applies, but gradually they're building up. And so to that extent, whether it's democratization improving things or just there's money being put into it and resources being put into it, and JNR is trying to improve. It's impossible to
How to
parse those out.
totally understand that. Thank you.
You know, sorry, can I?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
On this theme, before we lose it, good. Just a quick question, you know, well, an anecdote too. When I was in grad school, I was lucky enough to take a class with Oe Kinsborough Sensei, right?
Are you kidding
And he
me?
gave us, so listen to the story he told us. He told us about the immediate post-war conversion, the Tenkan, I guess, of like, okay, we're not doing emperor stuff anymore, we're doing democracy now. And so what one might expect, which is, okay, the leading local or mid-level advocates of the emperor worship, or you know, whatever, will recede and then will be kind of replaced by another group which is now advocating for this newness. And the way Oe Sensei says, no. He says,
Same dude.
as he remembered it, it was this very strident PE teacher at his high school or whatever, maybe I can't remember the exact whether secondary school or whatever. But there was so like, this is for the emperor, this is for the emperor, and just like
The next
day. He was like, this is for democracy, this is for democracy, right?
Now climb that rope.
Right, yeah, exactly. And so, you know, tying a little bit into what Ike says, this notion, this almost kind of paradoxical notion of like, well, we're going to do democracy now, and you're going to be Democrat, whether you like it or not.
Exactly.
This is how it's going to go, and we're going to define it. And you know, we're going to not only are you going to be tolerant of that, but we're going to brook no dissent in our new democratic thing, which is sounding a lot like, you know, sort of quasi-fascism in new garb or whatever. So my question is, as you looked at, say, other social entities such as PTA, and you know that were presumably running parallel to the development of labor unions at JNR and that kind of thing, do you see that phenomenon, or maybe a different way to ask it is, you said bubbling up. I'm really interested in, like, you know, gutai tekini, what that would look like, as opposed to people simply parroting what has come. Like, how would you?
Does it look any different? I mean, how can you tell if somebody's
that's-
just parroting versus?
That's what I mean. So
Yeah.
I mean, so to what would be the quantifiable or at least identifiable traits of something that didn't look like it was top down, except common sense.
Common sense. So it's really just relying on other people's scholarship who have studied the bubbling up, and so knowing it's there, right? And so I don't feel like one can tell the difference between, unless you have an actual individual who, like the PE teacher, was saying one thing one day and the next week flipped a switch. It's very, I kind of went through this in my first book when I was saying, okay, all these people are like, during the wartime, oh, Japan should be internationalist, and we cooperate with all these other nations by providing leadership for them. You know, like, and I, at first, when I was researching things like the Towa Kyodo-tai, the East Asian community, and reading people like Doyama Masamichi, who were writing about how this is such a great form of cooperation, I was like, but does he mean it? Or is it just an, and I finally realized it doesn't matter. I can't know if he was sincere in his heart. Did he love international cooperation? He's saying this, right? And so that's kind of the approach I've decided to take with this. Like, I can't know in your heart if you preferred the emperor. Maybe the whole time you were saying we have to work for the emperor, you hated the emperor, but you had to say that, and now you're really happy. You know, it almost doesn't matter if people are, like I said, I also can't tell if workers were convinced by this or not. But what I assume is, or what I think is quite clear, if everybody's being told this and everybody's saying this, a good number of people are like, oh, okay.
That's the new.
Right, this is how we do things now. Yeah. It's not a really satisfying answer, but that's the only thing I can come up with.
I get it. Sorry, Ben.
Oh, no. Thank you. This is a great talk. I was struck by how amuletic the concept democracy is. It's just say it and has this power by itself. And I'm wondering, does anyone at any point actually say, by the way, this is what democracy means, or they just kind of just run with it. So precisely because if you don't make it so specific, it becomes more useful.
Oh, they absolutely say what it means, but they say all sorts of things.
So are there like competing versions of democracy
Yes.
floating around?
Yes, yes, there are. So I kind of was alluding to a couple of them, but I didn't really give you the sort of clearest examples. I mean, there are texts that are saying, what does it mean to be a democratic railway man? Railroader. Some of them were women, so I'm trying to use a gender neutral term for that even. Tetsudojin. And then they tell you, right? So they're not talking about voting. They're not talking about rights. You know, but they're saying you as a railroad employee, how are you democratic? And so and they say, what does democracy mean? These social studies sections of textbooks, what is democracy, right? And then they say some vague things, but they're I can't say specifically, oh, this group says this. I mean, a bunch of different definitions. Certainly, the labor union publications definitely talked about we should be able to participate in management decisions. That's what democracy is. Democracy means having a voice. And that was very different from some of the more official JNR versions, which really were about, you already have the voice, so you can back off now.
Maybe I should turn to one of the questions. This is from Jessica Zhu. And she says, hello, thanks for the fascinating presentation. I love the idea of, quote, institutions of daily life, if that's your phrase, or is that what reflects what your primary materials say? I giggled along with you as you spoke of narratives of democratization, but not too many union labor strikes. I might be cynical, but after having read Grace Blakely's Vulture Capitalism, I wonder if corporations could truly serve as democratic institutions. What did you see in other sorts of nonprofit-driven civil society organizations, such as the parent-teacher associations? We've covered some of this. And I'm also quite curious about police at the mid-level as institutions for democracy.
Well, thank you, Jessica, for that question. Can corporations be? I mean, I think part of the point I'm trying to make is no, they kind of can't. Insofar as they are self-interested, but they're self-interested in trying to figure out a way to work within a democratic system, an officially democratic system. So working within the constitutional democracy, in that sense, yes, they have to be democratic, but they want to make a democracy that works for themselves. And so, well, if democracy works by convincing people this is how it works, then they're going to convince people this way. Democracy is this big amorphous thing. And so you can't necessarily say they're completely wrong, but it's a certain view of democracy. So maybe they can, but sort of not really. In terms of the other organizations, the railroad is the only one that I've really kind of read all the materials that I've collected. The others, I'm just still in the collecting stage. The materials I've read on the PTA that's the one that's the hardest actually to find good materials. But there were some, what got me started on it was a sort of set of pamphlets that was about how do you teach how did they phrase it? The teachers of the at-home classroom, right? The moms, how do you teach them to be teachers of democracy? So this idea that the mothers are gonna be the teachers in the kate kyoshitsu, and so the household classroom, and so we have to teach the parents how to be, well, really moms. They were talking about moms. I mean, some of the PTA materials does say parents. But a lot of it is focused on moms. We have to teach them what it means to be democratic. So it's more at the organizational level, it's kind of like we gotta teach the moms. And I can't remember off the top of my head sort of what the specifics were, but that one was not as jarring when I read it as service and hard work. So I think they have a different, in part because it is this kind of SCAP sponsor or promoted thing. So I think they had much more the American version of democracy in mind. The police are really interesting because obviously the police are a big part of what made Taisho democracy fail. And so I think there's a big responsibility there, and the police themselves are seeing it. There's a lot of, in like police specialty journals, like, I don't know if you'd call them trade journals. There are a lot of articles of like, what is the democratic policeman? How do you do democratic policing? What is a democratic policeman's relationship with the public? All right, and so they're trying to figure this out themselves. And what I expect to find is something along the lines, and again, I haven't read all of those yet, but something along the lines of what I found with JNR, that they're contested, that it's contested, right? Otherwise, there wouldn't be a ton of writings about it. And there are a ton, so I have a lot to read. NHK, I've done a little bit more work, but that one's more complicated because it's sort of this double thing where they want to democratize themselves, but they also have taken on the explicit goal of being a pillar of democracy. So here, NHK has a stated goal of, okay, we're going to help build democracy, and then they're doing it through their broadcasts. And so this summer, I'm going to the NHK library. They have, I'm hoping they let me in to look at some transcripts of certain shows from the immediate post-war period. So I can actually see what those broadcasts were saying, but I have not yet been able to crack that door open. Working on it.
Good afternoon, Professor. Thank you for coming today. I found your presentation compelling and comprehensive. There's two things that all professors love to hear after the presentation is over.
Yeah.
I want to express my gratitude for you being here today, of course. I'm sure everybody here shares that sentiment. I have a couple of two questions. The first one is this on this extent, right? It seems like, perhaps just because it's your research area, but it seems like the railways in particular were a focus for SCAP kind of democratization efforts. Were there other industries that were also sharing this? Was it to this extent, or was this really the primary kind of, I suppose we could say it as the torchbearer for this sort of movement? The second one is a bit broader. I'm Professor Uchiyama's class just happens to be kind of a focus of my term paper, which will be at the end of the semester. I'm helping you, so help me a little bit. I am curious about the type of democracy SCAP was looking to implement here. I have real doubts that they were reading John Locke, be like, yeah, this guy has the right idea. I'm very curious what exactly they're trying to do. Is it more of a pragmatic democratic vision? Is it more of just MacArthur's kind of more kooky vision of democracy that's being enforced upon Japan? So that's a broader question. Answer at your leisure, of course.
Okay, thank you very much. So in terms of other industries and the extent to which this was happening, the occupation powers understood the importance of the railroad, right? They wanted to get that up and running. This was seen as kind of, if you get the railroad going, you get the economy back in motion, then people don't become communist, right? Like all of that. And then we can build democracy. So it was really seen as, you know, as I used the phrase earlier, an infrastructure of democracy, right? They understood that. And so there was quite a bit of attention to the railroad in particular. I did see it in a lot of different things. So the way I started this project, after I noticed this in the railway, I thought, okay, this has to be happening elsewhere. So I just went to sort of databases of 1945 to 1955 of journal articles and did searches for these various ways of saying democracy, and skimmed through hundreds and hundreds of article titles and just looked for, whenever they weren't like, what is democracy? But more like, what is democracy for X? I would jot down the industry. And there was telecommunications, that's what led me to NHK. There was electricity, there was just business, and there was technology, there was education. It was, I had a little trouble deciding what my case studies were going to be because it was really everywhere. I ended up choosing ones where I just saw the most stuff, right? The broadest discourse, but it was really all over the place. And the second question, what type of democracy SCAP wanted to implement? I mean, SCAP, of course, itself was not united in this question, right? And so in cases when it was MacArthur, you know, it was his order that said, turn it into a public corporation. So I think the idea was just that this should not be a government agency. Right. Other times when it was sort of more specific legislation that they were talking about, it was different offices in SCAP that were kind of looking at that. And so it's really, there's not a single answer. But generally, trying to improve the economy without sort of recreating the economic hierarchies of the wartime.
Earlier, you had your hand up. Are we good? Anyone else? Anyone? We're good?
I'd ask one follow-up if we have time to take.
If you can make it quick.
Absolutely. How much say did the diet have? I'm curious.
Plenty. Plenty, yeah. I mean, certainly there were conversations with until 1952, of course. My project is going to 1955 simply because I want to see what happened after 1952. For instance, with both NHK and the police, laws that had been implemented under the occupation, they were like, psych, never mind, get rid of those. Right. And so I want to be able to see that change as well. So certainly the diet is not just rubber stamping things, but there is a lot of SCAP pressure and even like, no way you're not doing that, right? So.
All right, well, join me in thank, big one.
I think we did. Why Cocteau collapsed? Do you know?
I think it had to do with economic pressures.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of ink spilled on that.
Curious.
Yeah, yeah. As I said, my expertise goes only to sort of the 1960s, so
Okay.
beyond my knowledge.
Thank you very much, Professor Abel. So in case anyone is interested, tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, we will be hosting
The other
Professor Abel, Professor Jonathan Abel from Penn State University, who will be talking about his recent research on AI. It's going to be something to look forward to. So if you are free, any of you all here, or any of you all out still in the land of Zoom, please join us. Okay, thank you very much. We'll shut down here. Thanks again.